You ever notice how Generation X kind of slips through the cracks? We debate boomers like they're a political party. We analyze millennials like they're a social experiment. We turn Gen Z into think pieces and TikTok trends. But Gen X, they're quiet, watching, working, rarely announcing themselves. And that's exactly the point. Because the psychology of Gen X isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It doesn't beg to be understood. It was built in silence, in empty houses, in economic whiplash, in a world that kept changing the rules halfway through the game. Let me take you somewhere. It's 1982. You're 10 years old. You walk home from school alone. You'll let yourself in with a key hanging around your neck. The house is quiet. No notifications, no location tracking, no one checking if you made it home. You make a sandwich. You turn on the TV. You do your homework. You wait. This wasn't rare. By the mid-80s, millions of kids were coming home to empty houses every day. Sociologists later labeled them latchkey kids, but that phrase barely captures the psychological weight of it. When you grow up knowing that, at least for a few hours every day, you are fully responsible for yourself. Something shifts inside your brain. Your nervous system adapts. You become hyper-aware of consequences. If you forget your homework, no one reminds you. If you break something, you deal with it. If you're scared, you soothe yourself. Over time, that repeated experience wires in self-reliance. Not the Instagram quote kind, but the quiet, muscle memory kind. And here's the twist. Self-reliance feels powerful, but it's often born from absence. Psychologists talk about attachment security, about how consistent emotional availability builds trust. But Gen X grew up during rising divorce rates, economic recessions, and cultural instability. Watched institutions wobble. They watched adults promise stability and then lose jobs, lose homes, lose marriages, so their brains did something incredibly intelligent. They stopped expecting permanence. This is where that famous Gen X cynicism comes from. But it's not really cynicism, it's protective realism. If you assume the rug might get pulled out, you're less shocked when it's like emotionally packing an umbrella because you've seen the forecast change too. Many times, and this shows up everywhere in their psychology. Take work, for example. Gen X doesn't usually romanticize corporations. They saw loyalty go unrewarded. They've watched parents give decades to companies only to be laid off in restructuring waves. So instead of trusting institutions, they trusted competence. If you're a Gen X, your mindset might sound like this. I can't control the system, but I can control my skill set. That's why so many of them became quietly adaptable. Early side hustles before side hustles were cool. Multiple income streams before it was a TikTok trend. Not because it was glamorous, because it felt safer. Repeat economic shocks, the early 90s recession, the dot-com crash. The 2008 financial crisis didn't just hit their bank accounts. They trained their threat detection systems. Neuroscience shows that repeated instability sensitizes the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. You don't need catastrophe to panic, you just need uncertainty. And Gen X learned to live with uncertainty, like it was background noise. But here's something people miss. Beneath that independence is often a deep reluctance to ask for help. Studies on adult coping styles have shown that Gen X reports lower rates of seeking social support during stress, compared to younger generations, not because they don't have friends, not because they don't feel things, but because asking can feel like weakness. If you handled your problems alone at 8 years old, your brain builds a script. I deal with this myself. It's efficient. It's resilient. It's also exhausting. And yet, here's the paradox. While they may struggle to ask for help, they're often the first to give it. No announcement, no post, no public virtue signaling, just showing up. That paradox tells you everything about their emotional blueprint. Now let's talk about their relationship with authority, because it's complicated in a fascinating way. Gen X grew up in the shadow of political scandals, Cold War anxiety, and public health crises handled poorly. Watergate was an ancient history. The AIDS crisis unfolded in real time. Trust in institutions cracked early, so they developed a sharp internal filter. They respect competence, not titles. You can't impress a Gen Xer with hierarchy alone. Show them skill. Show them integrity. Then, you've earned something. Until then, they'll keep a mental eyebrow raised. This skepticism isn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's pattern recognition. When you grow up watching authority figures make flawed decisions, your brain learns to evaluate rather than blindly trust. And that evaluation extends to technology too, contrary to stereotypes. Gen X built much of the early internet. They adapted to email, mobile phones, and social media as adults. But here's the difference. They remember life before constant visibility. They remember what it felt like to make a mistake and have it fade away. There were no permanent digital footprints, no viral humiliation, no algorithm amplifying your worst moment. So when social media arrived, it didn't feel purely exciting. It felt risky. Privacy, for Gen X, isn't secrecy. It's safety. Their restraint online isn't ignorance. It's a learned instinct. The less exposed you are, the less vulnerable you become. In psychological terms, it's risk management shaped by experience. And then there's humor. That dry, ironic, sometimes self-deprecating tone, set whatever energy. It wasn't laziness. It was armor. When you grow up practicing nuclear drills in school duck and cover, as if a desk could save, your mind learns to hold absurdity and seriousness at the same time. Humor becomes a pressure valve. Irony becomes emotional distance. If you laugh first, it stings less. Defense mechanisms aren't flaws. They're adaptations. But adaptation always has two sides. Gen X might be one of the last generations that deeply understands boredom. Real boredom. The kind where you stare at the ceiling and your thoughts start wandering into strange, creative territory. No instant dopamine hits. No scrolling. Cognitive research suggests that boredom fuels imagination and problem solving. The brain enters a default mode network state, connecting ideas in new ways. In other words, being bored can make you creative. Gen X had a lot of unstructured time. And unstructured time builds internal worlds. They fixed bikes instead of replacing them. They figured things out with trial and error. Information wasn't instant. It was hunted down in libraries, in manuals, in conversations. That effort created deeper memory encoding. When knowledge costs you time, you respect it differently. But now, many of them are raising kids in a completely different environment. Supervision, constant documentation, constant feedback, and there's often a quiet tension. On one hand, they want to give their children the attention they didn't always receive. On the other hand, part of them wonders, does too much protection weaken resilience? This isn't generational superiority. It's generational contrast. Every generation solves the problems of the one before it and creates new ones in the process. Gen X solved emotional neglect with involvement. Younger generations are now solving emotional repression with openness. The pendulum keeps swinging. That's how cultural evolution works. But here's what I think is most misunderstood about Gen X. They're not detached. They're measured. They feel deeply. They just don't perform it. In a culture that increasingly rewards visibility, branding, and constant self-expression, Gen X can look invisible. But invisibility was once a survival strategy. Blend in, stay adaptable. Don't rely on promises. Build competence. Keep moving. They became the bridge. Generation analog, childhood, digital adulthood. They remember rotary phones and smartphones, encyclopedias and search engines, physical maps and GPS. Bridges don't demand attention. They connect worlds. And psychologically, that role is heavy. It requires flexibility. It requires tolerating ambiguity. It requires standing between extremes without fully belonging to either side. If you're Gen X watching this, maybe you recognize that quiet endurance in yourself. Maybe you've wondered why you don't quite fit the loud narratives about generational identity. It's not because you lack one. It's because your identity was forged in transition. And if you're not Gen X, if you're younger or older, there's something powerful to learn here. Independence and vulnerability aren't opposites. Skepticism and loyalty can coexist. Humor can be armor and authenticity at the same time. Every generation adapts to its environment. Gen X adapted to instability by becoming self. They adapted to broken promises by trusting skill. They adapted to exposure by valuing privacy. That's not coldness. That's calibration. So, maybe the real psychology of Gen X isn't about being overlooked. It's about being steady in a world that wouldn't sit still. And maybe there's something quietly heroic about that. If this made you think about your own patterns, about where your independence came from, or why asking for help feels harder than it should, take a second and reflect on that. Drop a comment about what generation you're from and what shaped you. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind everyday life, stick around. There's a lot more beneath the surface than we realize.